All right, we are now recording. All right, welcome everyone to our Water Resources Management Training Program. Happy Wednesday, and we're going to be talking today from Module 7 of 10 modules. This is best practices for groundwater data collection and reporting. This is brought to you by our donor, United Methodist Church, IsraAID, and Wellsprings Water Solutions. I'm Ann Murray, and with me today is Phil Martin, and we'll be presenting to you information regarding Module 7. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the schedule today. As you are aware, we will be presenting after a poll is taken, a presentation poll. We will present the first portion of this module. We'll take a break at 11 o'clock or thereabouts for about 10 minutes. And then we'll come back, finish up the presentation. I encourage you to please use the chat for questions. Raise your hand if you have more media questions that we want to stop and talk about. This is a really interesting module, and know that there is a lot more that can be done here. And I hope that this module inspires some conversation about what your specific needs are or your specific interests, things that we can bring back to you when we're either visiting with each other on the islands, or we can bring back to you more information that we can discuss during a workshop that's being developed for May. It's really important that we not only exchange information as utility folks between people who reside in the same island, but also to be able to exchange information between islands. This is a really interesting opportunity to be able to have that kind of exchange, to let each other know how we operate, or the things that were most interesting, or the things that are most challenging, and the solutions that have been created to address these challenges. So let's see, without further ado, have I missed anything on the, I wanted to also just say thank you so much for filling out the mid-training feedback survey. We were delighted to see the results of the survey that came back primarily positive in all the categories, with the exception, ironically, of time for covering the material, which indicates to us that you are very receptive to the information that's being provided to you, and we are thrilled to know that and really appreciate that that kind of feedback. It keeps us on track. It keeps us absolutely motivated to provide you the very best of the information that we have put together for you and presented to you, and will continue to do so until 1 week from today. And then we will be doing in-person training the first 2 weeks in April. So we really, really look forward to seeing you up close and personal, at least most of you. What else do I want to say about that? Just I think what we'll do is we'll move on now to the overview. And here we are.
Yeah, so we need to do the
oh, we forgot the poll. I knew there was something. I'm rattling on about the poll. Okay, so here is the poll. So I'm gonna launch the poll, and let's take 5 minutes and answer these questions. Thanks, Phil. It does take a village.
I'm not one to usually request having a quiz, but these have been so important and such good way to get feedback and all. I think it's we don't want to miss these.
I don't think so. This is a good tool. We have about 8 of 11 people who have put their answers into the poll. And we'll give it maybe just one more minute. Phil, can you see this up on the screen?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay. That'll make it kind of hard to take the test if you don't see it.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
I think it was the post-poll results that that need to be shared.
Yeah. So we're almost there. Been 5 minutes.
Got a couple more votes. If you could take the next 30 seconds and put your votes in, and then we'll move on. All right, I'm going to close out the poll. And here's what we have. Question number 1, when recording water quality data in the field, the choice of units for a given parameter. Most people voted, 8 voted for important to maintain the reporting consistency. Second question, the sampling intervals for data loggers are, bulk of the questions or the bulk of the votes went to often set to be more frequent based on higher water withdrawal rates and more variable climatic conditions. Number 3, standardization or standardized data collection sheets and procedure manuals can check all that apply. It's a multiple choice. There were 6 of 9 votes for the first one, prevent confusion. 9 of 9 votes went to ensure consistency in the data. And then there was additional 7 votes went to make the collection process more efficient, and then 1 for make the data more difficult to understand. Number 4, it is important when measuring water levels manually to choose the best answer. Most people chose all of the above. Number 5, the sensor manufacturer says that you should choose the best answer. Most said always transport and store in a safe place when not in use. Number 6, the purpose of a sustainable management program is to provide tools that help to meet all but one of the following. And most said raise the price of water. All right, so I'm going to stop the sharing of the results. And do that. All right, so now we should just see my screen, which is the presentation. All right, and without further ado, we're going to get started. I'm going to kick it off today. And here's the overview of the presentation. We're going to start with the purpose of the program, data sources, standard procedures, calibration and maintenance, and data reporting. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and we've heard this a number of times, but the purpose of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Program, and it's twofold. The first part of that is to address the immediate water resource management needs and to provide a foundation, secondly, to provide a foundation for the development of a long-term management plan. So those are the 2 things, short and long-term goals. So let's go through those individually. So the short-term goals include that we were really looking at the application of this current project and what it provides, which is a hydrogeologic assessment of the current system. This is going to form the foundation for a water database that we have been discussing. This data, the data that is collected in the Monitoring Well Network program will be collected and then deposited in the database. And these kind of data is going to include demand, water quality, and operational information. So why is that important? The water system management decisions can be made from this database and from the collected data in order to make better decisions or more effective decisions to operate the well fields and to meet salinity standards that continue to recover after post-Dorian. So this is our short-term goals to meet these more critical needs. In the long term, the goal is to continue to develop a management plan that provides reliable, high-quality water service to meet the current and future needs of utility customers while protecting the aquifer. So this is an evolving plan that will provide the foundation for a more robust water system capital improvement program and will inspire future regulations to safeguard water resources. We've talked about through these different modules how vulnerable a water table aquifer is, and being able to create a plan that protects through operational and protective measures is going to be extraordinarily important going forward. So this slide describes the components of wellfield monitoring, and they includes a variety of data from various sources and is collected in a number of different fashions. So to the left, we can see these components include water level, pumping rates, water quality. It includes data about the normal conditions, also post-storm conditions. So those are those critical events. We'll be collecting data on rainfall, which will inform an understanding of recharge to the freshwater lens. And also, what is the impact of tidal influence? On the right-hand side, there's a graphic that is from a collection station, a tide datum point at Settlement Point in Grand Bahama. That's the west end. And this is a really interesting slide. So I remember here in Florida, we had influences from king tides. So those are those significant tides that occur. They're high tides that occur in the fall. The tides are also show up in the spring as well, but they're predictable. So in this case, we have, oopsie, sorry about that. I'm a little crazy here. Must be that cup of coffee. So as I was saying, as I recall, in November, there's king tides, and we saw quite a bit of flooding here in South Florida. And this is based on this center of this graph, where you can see how the tides really change significantly from their normal tide at the beginning of November, and then towards the end of November. We see this band that goes from height in feet from, this is the 0 point, the midline is here at about 1.5 feet, but it goes all the way up to almost 4 feet. So this is very significant. So low-lying areas, tidal creeks, anything that's going to be influenced by these king tides will see this flooding inland. And why is this important? Well, it's important because not only is it considered nuisance flooding, but it also could have significant water quality impacts if you have assets in the area of these tides. It also will cause some character changes in the freshwater lens, even though these would be short term. The other thing that's important about this is that we know from past hurricanes that king tides can exacerbate the impact of storm surge because it's coming in on a high tide. I wanted to touch on the methods of data collection. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about today and that we have been talking about historically is that data comes in from a variety of sources, and it also comes to us in a variety of data collection methods. So in some cases, we'll be collecting manual data. Those are the data that you would collect from the production wells, from non-telemetry equipped monitor wells, information from pumping stations and distribution lines and so on. Telemetry provides real-time data transfer from those monitor wells that are equipped to the dedicated computer system that will be receiving these data dispatches. There's also published data like the tide charts that are provided by NOAA in this case for Grand Bahama. There's also meteorological data that other meteorological data like rainfall that are collected at stations on various islands at various points.
And if we could just go back to that slide real quickly, there was one other important point I wanted to make with regard to the to the utility of the tide trace that we have here, and that's to keep in mind that these fluctuations are going to be reflected to a certain degree, maybe not to exactly the same magnitude, but they will show up in the water levels in the well fields. And so going forward with the telemetry units installed and those sensors in place, you're going to be seeing these kind of changes. It's very clear that they're there. There's been data that shows that they're going to be lagged from what's happening at the data collection point by some numbers of hours, depending on location and general, relative position. But they're going to show up. So if you're not used to seeing this kind of continuous data, and depending on how those sensors are set up and the frequency and all, you're going to see these fluctuations. And it doesn't mean that something's happening in response to pumping. It's a tidal effect. And so it needs to be factored in as a change that's a background layover or overlay, if you will, to use the proper term, on the pumping data and the water levels that are reflecting what's going on with pumping. And in a similar fashion, you will see something like this with rainfall data. The water levels will change with changes in the overall precipitation and the amount of recharge that gets into the system. So those two things have to be taken into account when you're reviewing the sensor data, and it'll be something important going forward so you don't misinterpret what you're seeing as some new response to pumping, that especially if it's a lowering of the water table temporarily, that's saying that, oh, we may have to worry about upwelling of saline water. So just keep that in mind. You're going to be seeing this in the data to a lesser or greater degree going forward once we have that information coming in.
Thank you for expounding on that. You're absolutely right. It is not, tide data is so important from a water level standpoint, as well as understanding any impacts from water quality changes locally. So here's a graphic, critical event monitoring. So we brought this up because this is the state where Abaco, Grand Bahama are in so much as that this item C here in recovery. So I'll start by going through each phase of this conceptual model. In the top right, on the top box here, we can see that there's land above mean sea level. There's the freshwater lens that floats on top of the more saline water below. And that keeps its shape simply because of the density differences. In panel B, you can see that there's a storm surge located here on the right-hand side of the graphic, where the water level has been elevated and has overwashed the ground surface. And it has changed the character of the freshwater lens by introducing high salinity water into the top of the freshwater lens, essentially sandwiching in the freshwater below, and it's sandwiched in between the saline water on top now, and then below as it's in its natural state. In the last panel, C, this is recovery, where this higher overwash, higher salinity overwash water is going to gradually re-stratify, and it's going to allow that density difference to take over and the fresh water return to the top of that lens, and the more saline water to sink to the base and rejoin that higher salinity concentrations. So why is this important? Well, there's a few things that we wanted to talk about. Is that not only is this the current state of things, and this is something that is one of those critical points in in the monitoring program, it also speaks to how to best recover from this. And we talked a little bit about that it can take months, if not multiple months, that can stretch into years to get this natural state to recalibrate. So we want to keep an eye on the water quality trends so that water can be continued to be distributed, that the well field can be operated in a way that can effectively manage the balance between the higher salinity wells, the lower salinity wells, so you can deliver a good quality water or an acceptable quality water to your customers. We talked a little bit about how tides can amplify storm impact. Certainly that was the case with Dorian, and that because of this post-storm recovery condition, that the monitoring and sampling frequency, we probably want to start it off being a little bit more frequent with the sensor equipment, so that we get a better foundation and sense of the changing conditions as the water's being withdrawn through the freshwater lens. That helps to calibrate, and then as the natural state of density differentiation and stratification occurs, that will be a way to better understand that. Once there is a more I would say normal conditions in the freshwater lens, then the frequency can be reduced. All right, so the different data sources. It started off talking about.
Actually, Ann, this was a trade-off point.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that why it says my notes, Phil?
So Ann is wanting to do all the wrestling herself and not let the tag team come in and join her, which I think is great.
Phil, and you actually are prepared for this, so go right ahead. Thank you.
Well, let me say thank you, Ann, and thank all of you for joining us again this morning. I hope all are doing well and enjoying a cup of coffee and the presentation. We're going to pick up here with just the different types of data that are out there, the different data sources that we have. And while some of this seems, I think, very obvious, it's good to know what the differences are going to be. You know, where does the data get collected? What are the differences between them? And so what we have are basically three general sets of data collection sources. And these, of course, are in the field. It's the production wells, from which you're generally going to be getting, you know, your pumping information if you're recording that, if you have meters on the wells and have that ability to record that. If you are at any times taking depth to water in an individual well, either when it's first installed or perhaps down the road when there's an opportunity to do that, that would be some of that type of data. And so it's basically in the field, it's the water quality, those salinity parameters that we are concerned with, and the other ones that would be ancillary parameters that go along with what's able to be collected at this point in time. You know, going forward, we've talked already about how good it would be to have pumping data on a more frequent basis, and also when possible down the road, specific capacity data, and we'll talk a little more about that later in this presentation, but that's something that would be of high value. Then in the field, we also have, or you're going to have, the monitor and sentinel wells. And recall that the difference between the two is that the monitor wells tend to be a little bit shallower, and they're going to be recording the situations in the well fields in the proximity of the wells that are pumping themselves. The sentinel wells are going to go much deeper, and while they will have the sensors and the telemetry in them in most cases, they are also going to be used for running profiles. So in addition to the kind of the ongoing telemetry data that's coming in electronically and consistently on the frequency set, once everything's established and set up properly, we're going to be able to do these profiles where the salinity probes will be lowered all the way to the bottom of these and then raised up through the column of water to get a better picture of what that freshwater lens is really looking like. How healthy is it down there at depth? And especially where is that interface with the saline layer that's down there. Then we have what we're referring to as laboratory data. And by that we mean the data that's collected and then sent to the lab, for the more comprehensive analysis. And this would include the water quality, the comprehensive water quality analyses, your amounts of chlorination that's going on, you're getting the pumping rates. You're going to see an example of a good data sheet in just a few slides from what's been collected there. So this is taken from the distribution system as well, from what we understand, that you're checking on chlorine residuals at various points throughout the distribution system to be sure that that's all working properly. And just to return for 1 second back to the monitor and the Sentinel wells, I mentioned that how consistent that data is going to be, and that is certainly the goal, that with the frequencies established, that data is going to be coming in on a very consistent level, and it should be consistent across the board. If it's registering a particular depth to water, then you can know that that's accurate, with one major warning, and that is that you don't want to disturb those. In other words, if you happen to open one of those wells up for a reason and lift the cable to some degree, you want to be absolutely certain that it's gone back to exactly the same position, that it's not been disturbed from where it was, because otherwise you're going to have now a new set of data, because it's not going to register what it was before, maybe not set as deep, or it got lowered by another foot. You know, this should not happen with the way we hope to have these set up, but it might be possible. And it's just a good thing to be aware of, is that you don't ever want to bother those sensors when they're hanging in the well, unless you mean to, in other words, to have them out for calibration or cleaning or something like that. So there's just a little footnote to be sure that those things are left alone, except when you really need to disturb them for a particular reason. And then we've got what we're referring to as just other sources of data, and Ann kind of touched these already. It's the rainfall stations, and you're going to be getting either live updates from, like what's pictured in the left photograph here, of a station that has a tipping bucket rain collecting device on it that records the amount of rain by the way in which that bucket fills and angles itself. It's electronically activated and can give you real-time readouts of what's happening with precipitation. The tide stations, excuse me, you've already seen data from that, and that data is published and available, but it's also available real-time online through a number of sources. And then the events of floods. What we're talking about here is before and after an event. Before the fact, as Ann pointed out, if you are expecting a king tide, then you might want to be more prepared for some flooding. That's important information to have beforehand. And then after the event, you want to make a good written record of what happened. What did you see in the field when you got back out there after the storm has subsided? Is there damage from overwash? Is there wind damage? Do wells appear to be intact? Do the electrical panels appear to be intact? Is to record all of that. It's very important data so that you know, again, what's the health of the system? Are anything out there that's needing repair going to be taken care of? And those kind of data that will be really helpful with keeping the system up and running and healthy. So all of this is very important, because if you don't have these data to look back on and to be able to review, you don't really know what's happened in the past. And I think it's a fair statement to say that you can't predict the future if you don't know the past. If you have no idea, if you haven't paid attention and haven't been collecting the proper data, then going forward, you might not know that, with a particular storm coming up of a given estimated predicted magnitude, that we ought to go out and get the sensors reset to take more frequent data so that we can see exactly what's happening during the storm and following the storm. You want to be ready to go out and maybe do some more protective measures on any of the facilities. And if you do, then you go out after the storm. How did that hold up? Did a particular action that you took on a particular well make a difference? Does it look like that was successful? That can guide you in the future towards better protecting the assets that are out there on the ground. And this would include in the pump stations as well. Are there things that you can do to armor those stations? And if you have that information from how well it worked in the past, then you're already a step ahead with any future events. So that, if we can jump now to the next one, Ann.
I had a couple of things, Bill, just to add. And you made such great points here. So you had pointed to this monitor well with the rainfall tipping bucket. Please know that the monitor wells that are going in are not going to include tipping buckets, but we thought that this was a great asset to possibly include in areas where there is no rainfall data. Rainfall can be very localized. And so if you have areas that need coverage, this might be a good solution. We looked up these tipping buckets. They're about $400 a piece. Not an insignificant cost, but can provide a lot of good data. And the way that they work is it rains, you can set the frequency of the bucket actually tipping to be periodic. Maybe 1 millimeter of water, for instance, would be enough to trigger the bucket to tip. And then electronically, a signal, the data is sent to your computer to receive the rainfall as the bucket collects it and then tips and sends the amount. So kind of an interesting thought to incorporate, but our monitor wells, the ones that are being installed, will not include the tipping buckets. The other thing is, Phil, you talked about purposely disturbing the monitor wells with the sensors in it versus doing it purposely. And so in that case, a Sentinel well have these longer, they're deeper wells. The purpose is for long range understanding of water quality changes within the deeper depths of the wells, the deeper depths of the transition zone, so we can see water quality changes with climatic influences for specifically sea level rise. And so in that case, those sensors can actually slowly be pulled up to do profiling. And in that case, that would be an example of a purposeful use of removing a sensor, so there could be periodic profiling of a well from its greatest depth up to the top of the water table. With that, I will move on to the next slide.
I'm going to take a minute to address a good question that was asked. Mr. Smith said, during storms, we usually experience heavy rainfall. And would this rainfall compensate for saltwater inflow, or depending on the geographic of the limestone rock? The answer is really yes, to some degree in both instances here. That rainfall, if you did have a heavy rain and the ground conditions were such that you did get a pretty good influx of that water, recharging is some percentage, 15 to maybe even 20% of the rainfall hitting the ground is going to get into the ground and eventually get into the freshwater lens. It will help to some degree with maintaining that profile of the lens above sea level. And remember, again, reflect back on that relationship, 1 foot of elevation above sea level with the top of the freshwater lens means that the bottom of the lens is down about 40 feet. So maintaining that is important. So it will help. For an individual storm, it's unlikely that the amount of rain that might fall would make a significant difference, but every little bit will help. And the same thing, it does depend on the nature of the limestone at a given point in the ground. As we know, it's extremely variable out there. You walk 20, 30 feet and you may have a totally different situation with respect to how easily the rainfall can get down into the ground. But nonetheless, it in bulk, it will help, but it's going to be very, very sensitive to just local variations. So in general, to sum up again, I think the answer is that yes, this rainfall is a good thing. The more that you have and the more steady over a period of time that it occurs, I think that's also better because you don't get that sudden flux, which can oftentimes run off before it begins to really infiltrate. So thanks for that question. That was a good one. We're going to turn to types of data collection and the frequencies involved. And the graphic that we have here, we're going to get into in a little bit of detail, but it's a very good one. It gives you the recommended, or at least something to consider with frequencies of data collection under different scenarios, from less frequent at the bottom in the blue, ranging up to much more frequent in the red on each one of these 4 categories here. And what it's talking about is, for instance, the first thing on the left with the water samples in production wells, where we generally don't have water level access. Well, that's going to be as frequent as you can make it and as it's desired. And it's probably going to be somewhat low to begin with, because we do have shallow unconfined aquifer, which if you look at the graph, the shallow unconfined aquifer at the top, if you don't have the access, then you're not going to be able to gain much data anyway. But the idea is that at some point you'll be able to measure water levels there by hand if you needed to. And it may be a good thing to do sometimes just to keep track on a well that might be showing some higher salinities. Again, if you have that access, it's something that we are going to be recommending down the road for going forward, that all the wells have that established at some point in time, either when they're first drilled or perhaps retrofitted. So it could be that those could be daily, weekly, monthly for the individual wells out in the field. It's just a bit of an argument as to what level of frequency do you really need to have the information that you're requiring at that point that would be different from what would be coming from the monitor wells. Now, when we get to those, obviously we've got the telemetry units in. They can read down to within seconds as a frequency of data collection. That will be determined once we're out in the field and we have a better established idea of what we want to do. Pump stations, we know that at least on Grand Bahama, they're doing that on a daily basis, taking water samples, doing flow meter and pressure data, and recording how much water is being pumped, at what rate, what volumes are pumped in a given day. Those kind of data are very, very important, obviously. So those are going to be very rapid. So if you look at, for instance, going across in these bars on the right, where you've got groundwater flow and recharge rates expected to be relatively slow. And this is where we'd be talking about perhaps the production well sampling, data collection there. You wouldn't really need it to have rapid frequency of that, because in general, your flow is changing minimally from day to day, and the recharge rate is changing minimally from day to day. It's only in the larger scale, monthly to annual changes, where you begin to see, the real big changes that are occurring. So less frequent monitoring there can be, just as useful, and there's no need for real frequent things. If you start pumping a lot more, however, you go to the next one over, and you're really beginning to have an impact on your systems, on the freshwater lens, and you're impacting your water balance, then this is where it becomes much more critical. And the monitor wells will be giving you very rapid information, depending on how they're set up. And here again, you may want to be taking more care to be examining what's going on with individual wells, because given our karst variability, that increase in pumping could impact one well a lot more than another and start to cause some upwelling of saline water. The rain gauge, if we look at those are variable things. Obviously, you want to know if there is a storm, you'll probably want to have that recorded. So definitely on a daily basis, and then accumulating those so are we varying from the annual totals from past historic averages or not? Has something really started to significantly change? So that last bar over on the right, with climatic conditions from climate change, that's going to be a slower variation, but you still want to have daily data collection for these so that you don't miss anything. So if there's nothing happening, you perhaps don't need to just record zeros all the time, although that's helpful just to show that you did check this and it wasn't just a missed data point. The same with the tides. These are going to be going on an ongoing basis. Obviously, they're a daily process with 2 tides generally per day, and you need to know that so you can be cognizant of what's happening with water table fluctuations that turn up in your monitor wells. So again, it's one of these things that you need to take all of these into consideration and give some thought to what's the most useful and efficient way of collecting the data. You don't want to overkill it when you're not seeing any real change. And again, this is something that should be reviewed periodically so that you can go back and make the whole system more efficient and not have people spending time in the field or going out and having your sensors taking data at multi-second intervals when really multi-minute intervals, even an hourly interval might suffice in some cases. So just something to keep in mind. It's a good graphic for this. It gives some general guidelines. So if we can go to the next one, water monitoring parameters. This is going to be pretty old material, I think, for everyone by this point. We've covered a lot of this already, but just again, what is getting collected? And this is out in the field, of course, at this point. What we're talking about is the salinity measurements, either in just a salinity reading, but generally derived from the conductivity, TDS or chloride, or conductivity, TDS, and chloride. Yeah, those are the ones, or general salinity. And then these water levels will be coming in, of course, from the monitor wells and the sensors. And again, we would hope that down the road, some individual well checking can be done. Again, whether it's in response to a notice that water quality is changing in a particular well or wells, or if it's just to generally do some ongoing consistency type of things to make sure you're not seeing anything unusual happening with a particular well that's impacting the water table. And once again, it's important to establish protocols on how to do the measurements, where to do them, and what parameters are to be incorporated into these measurements. And this is so that there's less error introduced into the measurement processes. And obviously with the monitor wells, they're not going to be subject to this. They're going to be doing what they're doing and just humming away out there in the field without anybody having to really pay too much attention for most of the time. But with the others, where it's going to be the staff going out and recording these, and we'll talk about this more. We did talk about this quite a bit on Monday with the consistency of data and having procedures in place so that everybody's doing the same thing and recording the same parameters. I know from my own experience and looking at some of the data that there's sometimes things measured in parts per thousand, other times in parts per million. Sometimes it's in one particular water quality parameter or another. They're all interrelated, as we've shown and discussed, but it makes it much more easy for data entry into a database and for storage of data and interpretation of that data if everybody's basically on the same page and using those same units. So another thing that can help there, or what this will help with, is if somebody misreads a data point and enters something that you thought was in parts per million, but it's actually in parts per thousand, and so you've been getting readings of, 2,000, and suddenly you see a reading of 2, that doesn't mean something has radically changed. It means there's something. It's either an error in what was put in, or somebody just switched units and didn't note that. So it's a safety process and a data consistency and quality control process that can just be really helpful going forward. So if we can go to the next one, Ann. So in order to facilitate this, what's important? What do we do? Well, we set up these protocols, and that can include some of these items here, which is sampling schedule. How often do you need to do the sampling? What has been workable in the past? What looks good going forward? Establish that up front and have that agreed upon and incorporate it into any of your data sheets that you're going to have. Before you go out in the field, what supplies and equipment do you need? I can tell you from personal experience that I have on more than one occasion driven perhaps a couple of hours to a site to take a particular type of measurement and gotten there and opened up the toolkit and found that, lo and behold, someone who had used it perhaps the time before had not returned it. And I'm out there and I don't have what I need, and I've just wasted a couple hours of my time. And usually that's not a chargeable event. So it impacts the bottom line, of course. So being sure you've got everything you need ahead of time. One of the things that we've discussed certainly with I think Grand Bahama was in terms of when you go out in the field to do measurements on the wells, what's the path that you take? What's the order of wells that you're visiting? What's the most convenient? It's good to come to some agreement upon this and include that in the data sheets so that as each technician goes out in the field, they're working with the same process. And I know this may be a personal preference type of things that somebody may, well, that one's right next to this one, so I can just go ahead and do that one first. But it does help to prevent errors in that, you're thinking I'm on well W 55, when actually I'm on well W57, and I enter the data for 55 in that other field, and suddenly now we've got confusion over which value is correct. It's just a means of ensuring quality control. And this leads us to the field sheets. These are, I think, essential things. We've seen examples of them already, and there's one that's coming up in one of the additional slides here this morning that shows a really good example of one that's in use already. Then the field team assignments. This comes down to individual operations within the utilities themselves, and won't say too much about this, just to be other than to say that it's good to be sure that everybody knows what their assignment is. If you're going out on a particular well field tour to get sampling information and data collection done, is everybody sure of what they're going to be doing? If there are teams going out of multiple people, does everybody understand exactly what they're supposed to be doing? And this is probably going to become second nature, or may have already, but it's just something to keep in mind, especially if staffing does change. Again, is everyone totally on board with what they're supposed to be doing? Another thing that I can attest to from personal experience is going to a site where you want to do a measurement of something and finding out that the lock that's on the well hatch or on the equipment panel, the key that you have in your pocket doesn't match that lock. So it's good to be sure that there's consistency there and that everybody knows which keys go to which locks, if they're different for different fields or whatever. I'm sure that this is probably something that's become fairly standard practice, but it can happen, and it does happen, and it's just an efficiency thing, frustration. Somebody's now got to go back to the office, get the right equipment, and to get out there and be sure you're ready to go. So I want to just bring up something I know I'd said in one of the other modules, is that just remember the old Boy Scout motto of be prepared, and you're going to have better results in the long term. So it comes down to consistency and everybody knowing what they're supposed to do and being ready to record that data in a consistent manner. So if we can go to the next one. These are a couple of data sheets that we've just kind of worked up as samples, just the top portions of some. And they're showing just a good example here of what kind of thing can be set up. The one on the left, unfortunately, is a little bit cut off on the left side of it here in the screen, but it's the well ID. And so this would be, you enter the date. If it could be a particular day and time, but at least the month and the year at the top in the heading. And then if it's a particular change in days as you're going down, that'll be something to record. And just getting used to using these so that everybody's working off of the same parameters. You'll notice that we've got the salinity in parts per thousand, TDS, milligrams per liter, conductivity in the microsiemens per centimeter in this case, and then the water levels in feet. It could be that meters are going to be more important, or some other choice of parameters here. It doesn't matter as much as it being consistent so that everybody's measuring the same thing, and that you can trust and rely on going down the road that everybody's doing the same thing. It's also very important to know who is it that's recording the data, and comments, is there anything unusual there? And this would be the kind of place where you can put in, gee, it looks like this thing got hit, one particular well looks a little damaged, or there's a leak in one of the pipes coming out of the well, or it looks like somebody dumped a bunch of trash nearby. These kind of comments, and I've seen these on some of the field sheets that we've seen in summary tabulations of well conditions. So it's clear that this is recognized already as a good practice. This just formalizes it and standardizes it, which is, I think, a good way to proceed. Same thing on the right, which is something that'll be more and more important, especially when we have the sensors and the monitor wells all set up and the telemetry in operation, is to record observations of the status of the equipment. Is it all operational? I'm sure that if a pump station goes down or a particular pump is failed, that does get noted. This would be another maintenance log sheet that would be something that would come off of, for instance, the sheet on the left, where somebody puts, well number, XYZ, the pump apparently has shut down for some reason. Well, that would go into a sheet like this with the date and condition and the date and time, and like what's happened. What do we do? What is required to get this back up and running? It's a way of maintaining a record of what pumps have been repaired or what items of your equipment overall have been repaired at a particular time and date, and what needs to be done to get this back up and running. So these are just more things that are recommended for standardizing the reporting and data collection that can be very valuable. Again, you don't know what the future holds for a particular pump if you don't know that, maybe it did experience an electrical surge on a particular day last week, but it still seems to be running. We need to pay more attention to that one because maybe it's going to fail soon. So these kind of things can be very, very helpful. If we can go to the next one, Ian. So quality assurance. This is what all of this discussion has been about for the most part, is to make sure everything is done consistently, that people are sure that they're at the right location. One of the things that's recommended with all of the new wells that's going to be in place on the monitor wells and sentinel wells is on the concrete pads around those, there will be etched into the pad the name of that monitor well, the ID number for it. Similarly, on all of the wells, there should be some indication of which one is which. My understanding is that's mostly in place, but it really needs to be sure that everybody knows which well they're looking at, especially if there's new staff going out and they're not as familiar with the overall layout of the well fields. Physical description of the site conditions may seem kind of silly, but it really isn't. In my experience, again, when I've had to go out to a particular site and it's a blizzard, for instance, which was not all that uncommon in Colorado in the mountains, that would have some impact on your mental state when you're trying to open up a frozen wellhead or something like that. You may get into a hurry. It may change the way in which you, try to measure your data. I want to get out of here as fast as I can so I can get back to my warm truck. Or in the case of the Bahamas, more likely it's a lightning storm and it's pouring rain and you want to get out of harm's way. That can have an impact on your mental state in the sense that you're perhaps in a hurry and you might be a little more prone to error. So if you make a note of that, it just doesn't have to be anything detailed. That can help in any interpretation. If something does come through in the data that looks different, you may want to go back and be sure that everything was, there wasn't something else that was having an impact on the measurements that were being taken and the staff that's doing that. And not to say that anybody's going to be necessarily sloppy in their work at all. I don't imply that. It's just that this can have an impact on how you're doing your work. And it would give you a reason perhaps to go back and just double check, maybe get a second reading on that to confirm that it was correct. Also, and as I mentioned just a minute ago, if you go out to a site and something looks damaged that wasn't like that the day before or the last time you were out there, make note of that. What happened? What does it appear was going on? Take photos of it. If there's a big pile of new trash or it looks like a liquid has been dumped on the ground, that's extremely important to know about for contamination and water quality. So record those types of things. Again, take pictures. Each time you're out there, it's good just to double check to make sure that the datum point, like for instance, what this young lady is measuring in the upper photograph here, that nothing has changed there. Has this thing been knocked by a vehicle? Has it been bent over? Is it possible that measurement, which is important, for instance, measuring depth to water, could that have been changed? Just good to be sure these things are all accurate. And if you get there and you're at a particular well and you measure that point and it doesn't look the same as what it did last time, what's changed? Are you sure you have the correct well? And those kind of mistakes can happen too when you've got a lot of wells in the field and you're moving through to get your information collected. And then it's just another thing that gives you a double checking on your protocols. It helps to do that. And we'll talk about that again in another slide here coming up. So I think we can move on to the next one. All of this is important, and it just helps to be sure that everything's being done properly. And here's the flip side. So what can go wrong? And I put this little graphic up here. It's just a favorite one that I have of just, these are the kind of things that can make you crazy. If there's errors in any of your data, something really anomalous shows up, you've been recording levels of 1,500 consistently, and all of a sudden you see a level of 3. Is something wrong? Has something really changed that much, or do we have an error? The cat's going to get mad. did somebody record something in the wrong parameters? For the person that's going to have to record this data ultimately at the office end and get it into the database, the kitty's going to get mad again because we've got something that's raised a question and we don't know what the answer is. Why is this different? And is it really reflecting something that's accurate of what's going on in the field? These inaccurate depth to water level readings, it's easy to mistake these within a few inches even. But it's critical because we want to know if the pumping is impacting the water level truly, separate from tidal and precipitation recharge changes. This can get a little complicated, but it's important then that we can really rely on the data. Misinterpreting it. If there's a change, what does it really mean? Just what I said, could that have been a tidal change that raised the water level by 2 feet as opposed to that thunderstorm that happened a couple hours ago? That's important. If you misinterpret that, it could lead you to take action that's not going to be really reflective of what's going on. Entry and retrieval errors. This is in the computer end when you're putting data into the system for storage and further retrieval and analysis. Very easy for errors to happen here when you're entering lots of numbers. The obvious can happen. So quality control and being careful, having more standardized procedures can really help with that, and to keep that kitty from coming after you with his machine gun. And it's a loss of efficiency if there's non-standard processes going on and variations in how things are handled with data collection, then it's really not efficient. It means people have to go back and double check and be sure and spend time trying to understand what's happened. If everybody's getting to be pretty darn sure that they're following the same protocols, then I think the potential for any kind of errors is going to be reduced significantly. And I'm sure you're already aware of this and are doing your best to handle this, and just want to make the point that it can really make a difference. And I'll leave you with this thought on this slide. Think about the fact that every commercial pilot who gets into the cockpit of a plane, they don't just fire up the engines and take off like you do in your car. He's going to walk down through a very detailed checklist. Now, the reason for this is that even if he's done it 100 times, and this has been proven, unfortunately, but by virtue of accidents that have happened in the past where the pilot came in and said, I've done this 100 times, I don't need to worry about it. I'll just leave this thought with you. Would you want to get on that plane with that pilot knowing that he hasn't bothered to go down through the checklist? Well, obviously taking data in the field is not like flying a commercial airliner, but nonetheless, it's going to reduce the potential for error and keep your system running as efficiently as possible, keep that kitty off your back and get you to your destination in one piece. So with that, we can go to the transition slide next, Ian, and I think this is a good place for a break. We're just after 11. So why don't we take about a 10-minute break? It is now 11:07. We can come back at 11:17 and regroup.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you had a good stretch of the legs, and we'll get back to our presentation, and then we'll have time at the end, I believe, to be talking about any experiences that you want to share, any questions that you have that you want to explore together. So with that, I'm going to move into calibration and maintenance. And this we kind of touched on a little bit with our session on Monday regarding the sensors. And this is kind of sensor-centric, if you will. And the reason is that we're incorporating new equipment into equipment that you are already toting out to the field. And that might be a YSI meter or maybe a water level meter. And so these are going to come, we're going to be working through this together once we're doing our in-field training. And there's a lot of things that are going to come from the manufacturer. There's going to be carrying cases and instructions and manuals and whatnot that will help in this. But here's just a high level view of calibration and cleaning. So we're looking at manufacturer recommendations. Clearly, this is going to guide and inform how the equipment is maintained. And there's going to be a frequency. There's going to be a step-by-step guide as to how to maintain and clean and calibrate the sensors and equipment, including the telemetry unit. I suppose that not that it necessarily needs to be calibrated, but there'll be times when it's taken out of place and put back on, and there's going to be a procedures to make sure that everything's functioning as it should. So on the list here is replicate. So I think that this is really focused on that you can replicate the process, and that it's repeatable, something that you can get used to doing. So a proper methodology to be able to remove equipment, to clean it, to calibrate it. In this graphic here, we see that there's the level logger 5, which is the salinity sensor here. It has a coupling, something called a strain relief on the top. And then we have the direct read cable that is in yellow. And then there is the this unit at the top that will attach to the telemetry unit. So this is going to be a step-by-step. This is part of the manual. This is going to be a step-by-step methodology for removing and cleaning the level logger, which occurs periodically. We're going to be checking depths just to make sure that everything is correct. The cable length is going to calibrate with what you're seeing as an actual depth of cable or an actual length of cable. Decontaminating between uses. This, I think, that talks really, if you're going to be moving equipment from well to well versus decontaminate between cleanings of wells of dedicated equipment to a monitor well. So it's always a good idea. We'll talk about this in a little bit more in depth in these slides coming up, but decontaminate equipment between uses, even in terms of just being able to safeguard your data. And when you're talking about salinity, you're probably not going to get a lot of cross-contamination, but there are contaminations that can be carried from well to well. Bacteria, for instance, can be traveled from well to well, and then that can be an issue if you're not aware that that's a vehicle for contamination transfer. Storing and transporting equipment properly. So as I mentioned, that there are going to be dedicated places, homes for this equipment that is going to be mobile. The equipment that is in the well until it needs to be removed, like the telemetry units for storm preparation. Those are going to have some cases that will need to be used. I assume that they come with cases. These are not coming in cardboard boxes. They need to go back in the cases. They need to be moved and stored in an appropriate place, and then transported to the site, remobilized to the site, and installed properly. So here are some kind of tips that were gleaned from the manufacturer. And in the Bahamas, it gets hot. We have to be cognizant that when we leave instruments in the vehicle, it could get extremely hot in the vehicle. It heats up, and those extreme temperatures could impact instruments that are being mobilized from site to site. Again, these sensors are going to be installed in each of the monitor wells, 8 on each island, and then the equipment that is used to hang the sensors will be installed in each monitor well. With the exception of there's I believe at least one sensor that has been and cable that has been ordered for each island as a backup, and also can be used for profiling purposes. So this would be mobile. And then if there's, so that would be the case. And then, as I mentioned, the storm preparation. So you'd really want to keep that in mind in moving equipment and leaving it in the car. Or your vehicle, you don't really want to do that. You want to move it into an area that is out of the heat. So we have once a year inspected cables for damage, electronic connectors, and sensor ports for corrosion. So the sensor ports are down here at the base of the level logger. The cable you saw in the last graphic, and then any electronic connectors to make sure that everything is running as it should. When Phil had pointed out, when things go wrong, you'll start to see anomalies in data, and that is going to be a tip-off that something is not running smoothly in the field. Store cables in a plastic container only after they are clean, dry, and neatly coiled. So that talks about, again, mobile equipment and how to properly store them. Make sure that the instrument is running on software and firmware that is up to date. So this is free software that comes with the equipment, and the updates will probably come in the form of, because you are going to be downloading certain, downloading the software, which will now connect you to the main site. I suspect that there'll be manufacturer notices on updates to software, and that those software updates would be, just periodic, and that you'll get some notification. So again, this is about the sensors, but also keep in mind that there's going to be, you've got general use and protocol for keeping your other equipment safe and sound and clean and well maintained. Is this you, Phil?
This would be me.
Okay, look at that. I stopped myself and everything.
It doesn't look like me, but it is me. Yes, thank you, Ann. Good summary on that. The equipment, pretty robust, but very important to handle it with care and follow the manufacturer's recommendations and be cognizant of any potential issues there with how you're handling it. So we're going to talk about, just briefly here to close this out, with standard sampling and monitoring procedures. So if we could just go to the next one here. Actually, Ann, I'm sorry, this wasn't me. I was thinking we were down there at the data reporting slide. I got this wrong. This is you.
Oh, well, that would make some sense, because I was going to say I added a graphic, Phil, that you probably didn't know about. So, so we just are so fluid. We could just talk and talk about each other's slides and everything, but we do like to try to mix it up a little bit. It's a little more interesting for you all. So this is just two examples of best practices, and know that there's a lot more, and really we want to hear from you about what is important to you as far as specific procedures that you'd like to learn more about. We can bring this back to you in the May workshop. We can talk about it while we're together in the field training. So these two examples, this is the first one, is measuring groundwater with an electric tape. I think you probably are all familiar with a water level meter, whether it's a Solens or another brand. And so this water level meter has a probe at the end, essentially, that goes into the open monitor well. So you access the well, you put the probe in, it has a tape that is has measurements on it. So this really talks about, and I can't tell you how I really emphasize this with our field folks, is it's really a good idea to have a consistent place to read the tape. And so you can see in this graphic in the upper right that they've actually taken an indelible marker and marked a spot. And it says, in this case, marker for water level reading. It's great. That's really descriptive. Inside there's V24. That is the ID of the well. The well ID can be in several different places, both on the outside of the monitor well or production well and on the inside. It could be on the cap, it could be on the side. In this case, it looks like they've chosen to put the ID on the inside. So this is called top-up casing, as you well know. It's abbreviated TOC. And in this case, we call this point A. So this is if we look at this graphic below, I'm going to use my cursor and as a pointer. MPE is measuring point elevation. So this this and this point are where we're going to measure the tape. This point to this point is called the stick up. In a previous slide that Phil showed, there was a young woman who was measuring the stick up above ground surface. So when we report groundwater levels, we report it to ground surface so that it's consistent across the board. We talked that stick up can be varying depths based on each well's completion. And so when you have ground level elevation, that helps to be able to put that in terms of an even playing field. So we can take the ground surface measures and we can even add that extra, we'll add the level of elevation to it so that we understand what we're talking about as a datum point for measuring. So in this case, we have the top of casing, we have land surface, and then we have the well. And the important thing for this, for measuring groundwater is the probe goes into the well, it goes down to the depth of water, it rings or sounds an alarm that tells you that you're now a water surface. You take a look at the tape, you look at the marker for where you're taking the measurement, and you measure in whatever increments are on this particular tape. Let's say it's hundredths of a foot. And you report that in a consistent manner according to what your data sheets have in their header. So be consistent with the data sheet so that it's consistent across the board. So other things about this, when taking measurements in a production well, this is a monitor well scenario. In a production well, make sure the pump is off so that the line doesn't get tangled around the pump and impact your equipment. And then again, ideally the water level meter is disinfected between wells to stop the carrying of contaminants from one well to another. So that's just a good practice.
Ann, I want to just throw in another quick observation here.
Sure.
About what you just said about being careful of, the pump should be off. While it's pretty unlikely, I think, in these wells, because they're so shallow, one of the things that certainly I've experienced in the past is having the sonde at the end of the tape that's actually measuring the pressure down there, getting tangled up in the power cable going down to the pump. And in that case, you've got to be very, very careful to be removing them both at once, because you don't want to, start trying to lift a heavy weight of a full pump and all with that tape, because it could break. In that case, and you've got another situation where you've got the sonde drop down into the well, and you've got to get it out of there. That tape, especially if the pump were running, it could get caught up in the pump itself, depending on what the screen looks like in the intake screen. So it's just another one of these things to be careful of. It's very unlikely, I would suggest, in any of these wells out here, because they are shallow, but things can and do happen, and just to be very careful when you're doing those kind of measurements. Good
points. All right, I could have sworn there was a second slide here.
You can make one up.
I could make one up. Well, that's really odd. It looks like it's hiding. The slide that I had in mind was about general groundwater sampling procedures. And I think what we'll do is it had quite a lot on it. And I think what we'll do is we'll probably circle back to that one. I'll take a peek and see if it just got hidden or reshuffled in the presentation. But essentially, I'll talk about it just off the top of my head. And that is that groundwater sampling procedures may not necessarily apply unless you have specific needs. And this I gleaned from our conversation of Monday and some previous modules, is that there's not a lot of water quality that is pulled directly from the production wells. It's mostly done and collected at the pumping stations. In some cases, I recall that there was a discussion about nitrates, like high nitrate water, groundwater, and that's very impactful. And then in some, I think that was either New Providence maybe or Andros, where they were saying that it's a highly agricultural area, and they were concerned about nitrates, and so that they were taking samples there, if I'm not mistaken. Other reasons why you'd want to, we talked about coliform bacteria, that you might want to take a sample of groundwater. So the slide that is important to that discussion, and again, we'll bring it back up again, either through training or through workshop, is that there's a certain procedure, and this is it's important to have procedures written down so that there's an understanding between technicians of how to accurately purge a well to make sure that you have the well volumes required, the 3 well volumes evacuated from the well. Is that slide down here further, Phil? Am I just making this up?
I don't think so. It looked like the next slide was the transition slide. So,
so odd. Anyway, so taking a groundwater sample has some specifics. One is you want to be prepared to understand how to gauge a water volume being evacuated from a well. And there is a formula that helps to do that. It's a very easy formula that's applied to the diameter of the well, the volume, or the depth of the well to its total depth, and then the volume of water that is going to be evacuated to ascertain those three purge volumes.
You know, Ann, I do recall that. That was the graphic that I put together.
Evie just called me, and I answered him.
It is the craziest thing. Do you have it on your side,
You've been
Phil?
calling me, and I was
Let me
off the truck,
let me
but I
look
was
at
in
the
the truck all
module
the while
itself.
now, and Evie didn't just hang up.
Hold on 1 minute.
Yeah, because I could stop sharing my screen and we can go over to yours if you have it there. I don't have a good explanation for that. I just know that we have it.
It does appear to be missing. Let me just go back up, make sure it didn't get moved. Oh no, it's not there. That was the one that had the the casing volume calculation on it. Somehow that got removed.
That is the darndest thing. Well,
what I could do is pull the graphic up. And,
that'd be great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen while you pull that up.
Okay, this will just take a second.
Alrighty.
Assuming I can find it.
That'd be so much better than you all watching us tap dance through without a graphic. It'd be a little easier to see what we're talking about here.
This will take a minute because I've got just a whole huge slew of files. Which means that I might not be able to find it. Bear with me, I'm still looking.
No worries. I just double checked too. That is the craziest thing.
Yeah, and unfortunately on my computer, all I have these little tiny thumbnails, and it makes it very, very hard to discern one particular file from another. Let me look one other place real quick. No and no.
Well, in the meantime, I would say that while you're looking for that, I'll throw it out to you all. I had a couple of questions that maybe you could ponder while we're looking for this graphic. One occurred to me, monitor well networks on various islands. Here we have representatives from not only Grand Bahama and Abaco, but we also have representatives from Eleuthera and Andros, New Providence, Nassau. What are your experiences with monitor well networks? Do you have monitor wells? Are you actively collecting data? And then do you have challenges or do you have challenges with that data collection? Do you see inconsistencies? Do you see the need for procedures have you addressed those things? So that's one, is just sharing your experiences. The other question I have is, what field methods would you like to learn more about? Where do you have application? It's not a one size fits all. Well, and in this case, this general procedural slide was really aimed at, here's the basics. You access the well, you purge the well to get water quality that is consistent. And then you take your sample with a laboratory sample bottle, if that's the appropriate method. You label the bottle. You transport it, typically in a cooler with ice, to the laboratory within a certain period of time for analysis. So I'll open that up to the chat so that that you all can maybe respond. I do have a question here from Mr. Smith. Should the sensor cases be labeled as well to ensure that they cannot be mixed up when removed and put back in service? Absolutely, great observation. Yes, anything that you can do to identify and make sure that it's just really clear as to what goes where, and the equipment, just identifying it from the outside box is just such a great idea, or the case is such a great idea.
And I'm sorry to report that I am not finding that graphic. I'm not sure what has happened here. Obviously, we didn't follow the standard protocol. We didn't
have a contingency plan for this. So,
no,
but thank you for looking. Yeah. I guess what we'll do is we'll move on, and we'll just come back to that, the procedure at a later date. So Phil, okay. I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about data reporting.
Very good, Ann. Thank you, and thanks for answering that question. I had noted that too, and I thought that was a good question. So data reporting, and this is about, obviously now we've got the people in the field, they're looking to collect the data, and it's coming from all these different sources. What's the reporting process, and how does it get into something where it's permanently stored? So if we can go to that next slide. So here we're looking at data reporting from the collection to the database. And the idea here is that we've got handwritten sheets on one side, and then this is a page out of the prototype database for Grand Bahama right now as it sits. It's not reflecting the same set of data, so don't be confused by that. One on the left is a pump station record, whereas the one on the right from the database is a well field tabulation of wells and status and all. But these are two good examples of, first off, what the process is, and the one on the left, I just want to really give some acknowledgement to the way this is put together. This is a perfect example of what we've been talking about, of having a standardized data recording sheet that allows for entry, in this case, of a very significant amount of information. I mean, I know it's hard to see. Those of you who are on Grand Bahama who have worked with these know exactly what's in here, but I can give you a quick rundown. So it's a pump station report, and it has the data production from each of the 4 pump stations out there on the upper left, and then the timing and gallons that have been pumped. It has totals pumped, and gives rates and so on and so forth, and goes through a whole bunch of different parameters that are recorded here. And then similarly, it gets into where the water is going. It has things like, in terms of the parameters up on the top, amounts of chlorine that have been added, the level, which is, I'm assuming, is the storage level in the tanks, and pressure in the system, and accurate recording of times when these measurements were made. And then again, it's a very long summary of customers being served, how much water is being sent out to particular places, and that type of information. So this is a great example of a standardized sheet, and you can see that, even though there's a tremendous amount of data there, it's all organized and would be consistent. There wouldn't be any real difference between what one technician would be filling out versus another, because they're going to be following this sheet. So really good marks for this. It's well laid out, I think, and there's an awful lot of data there. And I'm sorry we can't blow this up even bigger, but it is a good example. And then the question is, then how does that get from what's there on the left into a computerized data storage, and that being the database or some form of having it recorded and memorialized on the computer so that it can't be lost. Obviously, the goal would be to save the paper copies, but it's always possible, and we know that it in fact did happen with Dorian, is that we understand essentially all of the pre-Dorian records were destroyed in the storm. And so having them transferred into a computerized database, and it may be as well that they were in a computerized format, but that the computers were destroyed as well. I don't know the specifics there. You from Grand Bahama would know the answers to that, and it'd be interesting to know. And that'd be one thing we'll be looking at when we are there. But what does it take to get this down here? Well, I think in this case, we've got a perfect example of a format that could be followed where we could just replicate in the spreadsheet this same layout that we see here on the left. And that would make it very easy then for the person in the office, the technician that's going to be recording this data into the computer system, to be able to just step right down through. They know this form from field experience more than likely, and then be able to just get it entered over. So a very good way of dealing with it. And you'd have it then memorialized in the computer. You'd still have your hard copies for storage and hopefully protected storage over the long run. And this makes it a whole lot easier by replicating that kind of a format. It makes it easier to get the data into the database and into the computer. And again, all of it aimed at following procedural protocols, following those standardized forms, increasing your efficiency and reducing the potential for data entry errors. And again, from experience, I can tell you that entering tons of data like this on a daily basis can be a little tedious, and it can result in some errors. But I think having these types of standardized forms will make it a whole lot easier to avoid something being missing and be obvious right away. If it's something's out of place that was on the hard copy sheet, suddenly you don't see anything filled in for that respective field over on the computer. So just really helps with efficiency and quality assurance. And if we can go to the next the next example slide.
Absolutely. I will put a plug in for our next module. Some of you are wondering, like, well, this is really interesting. I'd like to know more about that. Our next training session on Friday is going to be talking about the database, the tools, and visualizations. So we'll look forward to talking with you more about that then. Good
point. Thanks, Ann. So data reporting in between the field and between the office. They're both critical activities and both imperative for the long-term success of your management plan. And they both offer up opportunities for either decreasing or increasing, hopefully, your accuracy, your consistency, and your efficiency. By following these kind of protocols and set procedures over long term, you're pretty much, I wouldn't say guaranteed, but it's a much higher likelihood that you're going to have longer term success. You'll be able to get a greater sense of just how your system is living and breathing, whether there's parts of it that require attention, whether there's types of data perhaps, or data frequencies that need adjustment. And that brings me to that point on the left here about periodic review. We've said this in the past on some of the other modules, but it's something that should be kept in mind. What gets set up initially, and this would be true of the sensors, but also just the regular day-to-day data collection processes in the field and how things are done, and data entry into the computers. It's good to review those periodically. Are they working? Is this really what you need? Is it too much? Is it overkill? Are you getting more data points that are almost identical over a particular period of time that just show no variation whatsoever, and so you could potentially change that? Are there processes that appear not to be working right? Are we seeing gaps? Are we seeing errors routinely turning up in one particular aspect or corner of this type of data collection and recording? If so, then that's something that needs to be looked at and addressed. Point here is just not to do it once and think that you're done and you don't ever have to come back and review that. It brings up the opportunity to bring the team together, to look at this, to look at how it's being done, take input from everybody involved. The field staff, they're out there doing this kind of work and doing these data collection processes. Which of these forms seem most efficient? Which ones are causing them problems? Are they having any particular issues with? Do they see additional fields in a particular form that maybe would be helpful and potentially required in order to really be effective with how you're managing the systems? So these kind of things are very, very important. Similarly, with what we have over on the right, all too familiar and too frightening of a picture, a hurricane from outer space. Being prepared for a storm, for both ahead of the storm and for following up after the fact, should include a number of things. Your regular data collection should go forward, of course, but you need to start being really sure that you've got redundancy and backup in especially your computer systems and the data files, hard copy files that need to be kept as safe as possible from damage. With the experience of the utility on Grand Bahama during Dorian, that must have been a devastating thing to realize, is that all of that historical data has been destroyed in spite of, I'm sure, multiple efforts to make sure that that didn't happen. I don't think anybody anticipated the magnitude of what this disaster was going to be. So careful storage and getting as much redundancy. I use the example of putting all the computer data onto thumb drives, and I would say plural thumb drives. It might be important that there be several copies of these so that if one does get lost or damaged, somebody takes it back to their house, which is a good idea, and that house gets flooded and that data gets lost, then there'd be always another one. Being prepared for this and being ready to go so that you can have confidence that in the worst case, you'll still be able to revive your data and get it back into the system and rebuild what was lost, and without having to have major interruptions in the flow of data that you have and the analyses that can be done. And then while it's not really addressed here, is to consider what do you do after the storm, is to get the whole system back up and running. But as we've pointed out before, and I just want to stress it here again, it's one of those things where you're in a dynamic situation at that point. As you know, it's possible that some of the fields could have been overwashed. You could have some significant saline problems with the upper portions of the freshwater lenses that have now become polluted by salt water and overwash. This is the time to start redoubling your measurements and to get more frequent reporting from your telemetry units, and to be sure that you're keeping track on what's changing and how fast is it changing, so you can then, to the extent needed, make some predictions on how long this is going to take. When can you assume that the system may be back into a more or less pre-storm state? When is our water going to be back to being able to be easily drinkable again without having to worry about too much salt in it and those types of things? What other treatment might be necessary? All of that. So redoubling the efforts after a storm should be just part of the routine process, and there should be protocols written for this and put into place so that everybody's aware of what would be needed, and to go forward from there with, again, the best potential for having what could be a terrible disaster like happened with Dorian become, obviously a significant problem, especially if there's real damage and any injuries or, God forbid, loss of life. But turn something of a storm that didn't have to be that bad with respect to what happens to your data into something that's manageable and recoverable from. So with that, we go to the last slide. And just some additional thoughts on all of what we've talked about. This has to do with longer term planning with your system. Obviously, a lot of the things we've talked about are going to require additional capital and additional expense going forward, just to bring in some of the new stuff that we've talked about. The telemetry and systems and monitoring holes is one great example. These don't come for free. It takes money to get these things in place and a lot of effort. Should also be recognized, however, that all of the systems that are here and the components, both the physical components in the field and especially the computer hardware and stuff, not only do they fail. Hard drives are known to fail. Computers do need to get replaced. There is the need to update software. Those types of things happen, and sometimes the software changes to the point, as has happened with, just as an example, with the Windows operating system over time. It gets to the point where the older computers can no longer even run the new software, and there may be great new tools and security involved in that new software that you really want to have. Well, you've got to be able to plan on doing those kind of upgrades and incorporate that into the long-term planning, and for periodic review of your systems, what's working, what isn't, and to incorporate that into capitalization plans, funding plans for how you're going to keep the system running, and moving forward with the incorporation of potentially some better new tools and new opportunities for improving how you run and operate your system. So that will take us, I believe, to the final slide, which is just a summary of what we've covered today. We've looked at the purpose of a sustainable water resources management program and all of the factors that go into that, both short and long term. We've looked at the sources of data that you need to be concerned with and covered those in quite a bit of detail from the various components that we have out there, hand measurements, the telemetry, the laboratory sources, things like that. Looking at the importance and the imperative of having standardized procedures and protocols for doing the measurements, quality control becoming a factor in everyday processes and standard practices. Looking at the calibration and maintenance of your equipment. Is it running the way it should be? Are you keeping it up to date with what's needed for potentially the software updates for some of that? And this would get into the computer software as well, as we just talked. And then the importance of data reporting and how you can begin to look forward at the integration of the field data sheets that are done into the computerized data recording in the databases. It may be possible, and it may even be happening now. This is something we need to learn about more, that, for instance, going out with an iPad or some type of tablet computer and entering the data in that means in the field immediately saves one step. You've got it already into the computer, and it can be transferred easily into the master databases down the road. So that's what we've looked at, and thank you for participating in this. And I don't know if we have questions to follow up, but Ann, I will turn it back over to you for any final thoughts.
Thank you. I don't see anything else in the chat. So as always, if you have questions that occur to you, please, please use WhatsApp and pose the questions. Glad to follow up on anything that you're curious about, interested in. This could be very familiar territory, and really it's kind of another opportunity for us to learn more from you than perhaps the other way around. So we'll look forward to sharing experiences when we're together again. Well, without further ado, I think that what I'll do is I'll bring up the poll, and I'm going to relaunch the poll. Okay.
Good.
All right, and away we go.
Should we take about another 5-6 minutes on this, Ann?
Right, I think so.
Yeah, we're just a little running pretty good on time, so we'll come back in about 5-6 minutes.
Okay, I'll give this another 30 seconds. I see there's maybe two more votes that need to be cast.
While we're waiting on those two, I had put a note in the chat that maybe appropriate for this session where we could share some of our sample collections. This is now good that we're going to do well field samples, which we had previously kind of taken for granted. But we do have a very regimented monthly schedule of sample taking at all of our sites. And once at the appropriate time, we could probably share. Cubell does it in Abaco, so maybe they want to share one or two.
That would be outstanding.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yes, sir. Okay, then, yeah. What we do here in Abaco in terms of sample collection is we check for salinity, conductivities, and a chlorine level in the system. Also, we take a sample from the pumping station in the various community, and in those community we go to the settlement. Take for instance Marsh Harbor. What we will do is take a sample from the actual pump house, and then we will go in the various communities like the far end ones, like Eastern Shores, and we will collect a sample. And then at Murphytown at the southern end, and we will take a sample. Then we will collect, we collect those samples and we send them to Nassau once a month for more in-depth testing. And so that's what we do. We make sure check every well field within the Abacos and the middle of the system and at the end of the system to make sure that our chlorine level and everything is consistent throughout our system.
Right, and you can imagine we operate 65 water systems on 25 islands and keys. So that right there is a logistical challenge always every month to collect all of those samples and send them into the lab. And of course, timeliness is important such that the bacterial work can be done. But we have been very good and consistent in doing that on a monthly basis.
Yes.
I'll bet that takes a lot of coordination.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes.
And talk about consistent results and reporting methodologies and.
Maybe the lab wants to speak to that, but every month they would send us a full analysis of the various parameters. They all tested to WHO standards.
Great. You know, just out of curiosity, personal curiosity, is I'm wondering how I know the Bahamas are spread out over a very large area. Do you fly the samples to Nassau for the analysis or by boat, or how do you get them there quickly enough?
Basically, we send down the coolers pre-prepared from the lab by boat. Mm-hmm. If time is running out, then we'll ship them by plane because we want to get them in early enough. Right. We have to take secondary samples. But most times they put them on the plane and fly them back.
Wow, boy, that must be logistically quite the whole process every month. I really acknowledge you for having to manage that. That's quite a handful.
How many staff members, what kind of resources do you need to manage, what you said, 65 water system samples or 65 water systems that you sample?
Right, we have a full-time logistical team of 4 persons, but they have to coordinate it. They don't just coordinate sample collection. They coordinate weekly shipping to 25 different locations across the Bahamas, mail boats, planes, items to the islands, and then islands have to send back items on a regular basis for refilling drums and equipment. So it is quite a logistical challenge, but we have been mastering it and getting better with time.
That's great.
So that's on a monthly basis.
no, I wouldn't say monthly, that's an ongoing basis.
Ongoing.
Shipped, the coolers are shipped on a monthly basis, shipped back on a monthly basis, but constantly tools, supplies, equipment is shipped back and forth between all the 25 islands and keys. So it is ongoing and every day.
Wow.
You have to deal with mailboats, planes, trains, and automobiles.
I'd like to see those trans-island trains. That would be interesting.
Yeah, well, no trains. Right? It is another challenge for an archipelago.
Absolutely, yeah.
That is fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. And that's that was a high level overview of something that sounds very complex.
And of course, we have to manage the chain of custody for all of these things.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that too, yeah.
Right.
So the lab can speak to that if they wish, because even the timing, they have to come in within a certain time.
Right.
Right. Specific. And do you take the same sample set? The same analytes are being tested at the laboratory for each of the 25 locations?
OJ, you want to speak to that?
You want me to get that?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Gibson. Yes. So basically, right now we would do well. Thanks to the training that's taken place for our family island staff. So our staff, of course, they're capable of conducting the testing of the basic on-site parameters that we were talking about previously. So of course, our conductivity and salinity as well. And when they get into the lab, sometimes we may have issues on some of the family islands, some of the instrumentation may not be there. So even in lab, we would do further conductivity or salinity testing as well. And also we would then do testing for anions, cations, of course, hardness and total hardness, magnesium, we would carry out in the lab, as well as we would also do the microbiological analysis as well too. So we, of course, we'd be looking for our coliforms, total coliforms, yeast, mold, etc. within the lab.
Boy, that's a full-time job. I'm sure you have a number of technicians working with you in the lab.
Well, presently the staff complement is about, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 5 technicians actually.
Yeah.
5 technicians, believe it or not, considering the sample, the flow of samples that we have here that come in from Abaco to Nagua.
Yeah. Wow. Impressive.
That's you've got to run a pretty tight ship.
Yes.
That is really interesting. I'm really glad we had that discussion, and I definitely want to hear more, because that is it's really valuable, and to understand the big picture, which is it's not just one utility with one laboratory. Here's you're managing 25 locations, 65 systems, and then the logistics getting those materials back and forth is just kind of mind-blowing, really.
Never a boring day.
I'm sure. 65 well field systems. Okay.
Well, it's actually 25 well fields, and the other 25 are RO plants.
Okay. Okay.
And in 2 locations, we have a combination, especially, and that's why we wanted to include other islands, especially Andros and Eleuthera, where we have active management. Even 2 combinations of well fields and RO.
That's really interesting. Appreciate that so much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to value your time, and we've gone into a little bit of overtime. So I've shared the poll results. So we'll start with question 1. When recording water quality data in the field, the choice of the units for a given parameter is. Most people voted for important to maintain for reporting consistency, and that is what we were looking for. Now, the individual taking the measurements, I will acknowledge that those data sheets would inform what what data would be included and then in what units. So moving on to number 2, the sampling interval for data loggers are choose the best answer. We had 58% said often set to more frequent based on higher water withdrawal rates and more variable climatic conditions. This is the answer we were looking for. There were some who said determined by sensor unit itself and based on the conditions in the well. You know, that's not an unfair choice, but we were looking for the frequency is more based on that water withdrawal and climatic condition impact potential.
And just to build on that real quickly, because I think there is, there was some potential for a little confusion on that. I mean, the sensor, once it's set, it will log. If you tell it to do it 1 minute, it will do nothing but 1 minute. I mean, it won't change, but you can change it. But once you've set it, it does it. So the sensor is not changing to conditions, unless it's told to. There may be in the future ones that are smart enough to understand or be programmable such that they would do that kind of thing. In fact, for pumping tests, where you've got longer term tests in a confined aquifer, you can actually set it to take basically on logarithmic time. You start out with very short time intervals and then they gradually open up. And this is when you're running like a 24 or 48 hour or even longer pumping test on a confined aquifer well. But for now, it's the operators and the managers that decide, okay, here's the units that we want to sample on, and it's fixed once it's in place, but it's set by the operators.
That's a very good point. Thanks for clarifying that, Phil. I have to say that the questions are not easy to come up with, and then to make sure that the answers are clear enough, the choices are clear enough. So a little extra clarifications sometimes very helpful. Let's see. So we're at number 3.
Yes.
Standardized data collection sheets and procedure manuals can check all that apply. It's multiple choice. Most people had voted for ensure consistency in the data. That is what we were looking for.
Well, and actually, any that
Oh, wait a minute,
apply,
this was
yeah.
all of them, wasn't it?
Any
this
that
was
apply, yeah. So
all that apply, and so it was a kind of a trick question, and I see that there was a really good spread here. So we had prevent confusion when downloading the data. Is this how this one went? It was definitely ensure consistency in the data and make the collection process more efficient.
yeah, so these 3 they really they nailed it. These are the 3 that are most important.
Yep,
And,
so we had good spread.
we got a spread between those, and so this is good because I'm glad nobody picked make the data more difficult to understand, because that's really not what we're hoping for. So this was good. This was a good response.
A very good response. So number 4, it is important when measuring water levels manually to choose the best answer, and the best answer was all of the above. It's a process, and so these are components of number, A and B are components of the overall measuring procedure. But in this case, I would say all of those components above would be a good answer.
And this will be something that we can demonstrate out in the field. I think it's sometimes easier to see it being done and then do it yourself and get
Yeah.
a sense of it. And once you see it, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes just from a diagram, especially, when we're going through these things fairly quickly, it's not as easy to catch. So if you didn't have all of these in place or still have a question in your mind how this works, don't worry about that. We will go through that when we're there in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. Number 5 is the sensor manufacturer says that you should choose the best answer. Always transport and store in a safe place when not in use. We had most of the votes went to that answer, which is what we were after. And there is a calibration element, and so that's fair. I think it was calibrate twice a year, but calibrating at some frequency is definitely is a good consideration.
Yep.
The purpose of a sustainable management program is to provide tools that help to meet all but one of the following. And that would be raise the price of water. We don't want to do that. So we had most answers were correctly placed. Okay. Well, with that, thank you for staying with us through this overtime. I appreciate it, as I'm sure Phil does. And we
Very
are
much.
looking forward to seeing you on Friday, where we'll talk about the database and visualization of data. So that will be a really interesting training session. So we'll see you on Friday. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for the conversation. It was it was really great to hear your responses.
Have a great day, everyone. We appreciate you being here.
Another great session.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much. Appreciate that.
Much appreciated.